Your body is not falling apart, it is simply waiting for you to remember how to speak its language again. There is something quietly profound happening inside every body that crosses the threshold of 50 years, and it does not announce itself with dramatic fanfare or sudden collapse. It arrives gradually, almost imperceptibly, the way a season changes not in a single moment but across countless small shifts in light and temperature that you only notice once the transformation is already well underway. Scientists have given one dimension of this process a name, sarcopenia, derived from the Greek words for flesh and loss, and while that clinical term carries real weight in gerontological research, it captures only a fraction of what is actually unfolding inside the aging muscular system, because the story of the glutes and aging is not simply a story of tissue disappearing, it is a story of communication breaking down, of signals growing faint, of a conversation between the brain and the body that once flowed with effortless fluency beginning to stutter and slow in ways that accumulate quietly beneath the threshold of conscious awareness. The gluteal complex, comprising the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and gluteus minimus, represents not merely the largest muscular group in the posterior chain but one of the most neurologically sophisticated movement systems in the entire human body, responsible for hip extension, lateral stability, pelvic control, rotational force, and the foundational postural architecture upon which every upright movement depends. And yet, despite this extraordinary functional importance, these muscles are among the first to experience what researchers in exercise physiology describe as neural inhibition, a process whereby the nervous system, responding to prolonged periods of sedentary posture, essentially learns to route movement signals around the glutes rather than through them, recruiting the lower back, the hip flexors, and the quadriceps to perform tasks that the gluteal muscles were originally and brilliantly designed to handle. Decades of sitting, at desks, in cars, at dining tables, in the accumulated hours of a life lived largely in a forward-facing, flexion-dominant posture, gradually teach the body a kind of muscular forgetting, and this forgetting is not metaphorical but neurological, rooted in the principle that the nervous system is always optimizing for efficiency based on the movement patterns it encounters most frequently, which means that muscles rarely called upon become progressively less available. Their motor units recruited less readily, their firing thresholds rising until what was once an automatic and powerful muscular engagement becomes something that requires deliberate, conscious, and sustained effort to access at all. What makes this particularly significant for adults navigating the second half of life is the cascading nature of gluteal inhibition. Because when the largest and most powerful muscles in the posterior chain go quiet, the entire biomechanical system reorganizes itself around that absence, placing compensatory demands on structures never designed to carry that load, tightening the lumbar erectors, destabilizing the sacroiliac joint, altering the tracking mechanics of the knee, and subtly shifting the body's center of gravity forward in ways that accumulate over months and years into the postural changes and balance vulnerabilities that so many people over 50 experience and mistakenly attribute to the inevitable and irreversible mathematics of age, when in truth what they are experiencing is not inevitability at all but the correctable consequence of a communication gap between a nervous system and a muscular system that simply need to be reintroduced to one another with patience, consistency, and the right kind of deliberate movement practice. We tend to look downward when balance falters, and there is something deeply human about that instinct. When the ground feels uncertain, the eyes seek the floor, the hands reach for walls, the attention drops to the feet as though stability were a problem rooted in the very surface we stand upon, and while the ankles and arches and the complex proprioceptive network of the foot do play a genuine role in postural control, the science of movement and the growing body of research in gerontological biomechanics consistently points our attention upward, toward the hips, toward the pelvis, toward that broad and powerful muscular architecture that wraps the posterior and lateral surfaces of the joint where the femur meets the acetabulum, because it is here, not at the foot, not at the ankle, but at the hip, that the body's most fundamental conversation about balance is actually taking place. And understanding this distinction changes not only how we train but how we think about the aging body and its relationship to the ground it moves across every single day. The gluteus medius, that fan-shaped and often overlooked muscle running along the lateral surface of the ilium, carries within its fibers a responsibility that far exceeds its relative obscurity in popular fitness conversation, because it functions as the body's primary lateral pelvic stabilizer, meaning that with every step a human being takes, It is the gluteus medius that fires to prevent the opposite side of the pelvis from dropping toward the ground, maintaining the level and controlled trajectory of the hip that allows the spine above it and the knee below it to track with the mechanical precision that pain-free, confident movement requires, and when this muscle weakens or becomes neurologically inhibited through disuse and prolonged sitting, as it so commonly does in adults over 50, the pelvis begins to shift and drop with each stride in a pattern that clinicians and movement scientists refer to as a Trendelenburg gait, a subtle but biomechanically costly deviation that sends compensatory ripples upward through the lumbar spine and downward through the knee joint simultaneously, creating the conditions for the chronic pain, the joint degeneration, and the progressive loss of movement confidence that so many people in the second half of life come to accept as simply the texture of growing older. What the research in fall prevention and postural stability continues to reveal, with a consistency that should reshape the way we approach fitness for older adults entirely, is that hip abductor strength, the capacity of the gluteus medius and its surrounding musculature to resist lateral pelvic movement and maintain stable, controlled single-leg loading, is among the most powerful predictors of fall risk in adults over the age of 50, outperforming measures of ankle flexibility, foot sensitivity, and even overall lower limb strength in its ability to distinguish between those who move through the world with confidence and those who navigate it with the quiet and exhausting vigilance of someone who has learned to fear the ground beneath their own feet, which means that any serious, scientifically grounded approach to rebuilding balance in the aging body must begin not with ankle circles or balance board exercises, but with the deliberate, consistent, and patient reawakening of the lateral hip musculature that forms the true foundation of postural control. Seated exercises enter this conversation with a particular and underappreciated elegance because they accomplish something that standing balance work sometimes cannot. They remove the psychological and neurological burden of fall fear from the training environment entirely, and this matters in ways that go far deeper than simple comfort or convenience, because the nervous system of an adult who has experienced falls, or who carries the ambient anxiety of knowing that a fall is possible, operates in a state of chronic low-level threat response that actually interferes with the quality of motor learning, keeping the stabilizing muscles in a pattern of protective tension rather than the relaxed, responsive readiness that genuine neuromuscular training requires. And when the body is seated, when the fear of toppling is genuinely absent rather than merely suppressed, the nervous system softens its vigilance in measurable ways. Heart rate variability improves, muscle tone normalizes, and the brain becomes significantly more receptive to the motor signals being sent through the gluteal training movements, meaning that seated glute work is not a lesser or modified version of real balance training, but in many cases a more neurologically efficient entry point into the rebuilding of the very stability systems that protect older adults from one of the most consequential health risks of the second half of human life. Let us move now into the living, breathing reality of what these three movements actually are, not as abstract exercise prescriptions written in the clinical language of rehabilitation protocols, but as genuine invitations to reconnect with a part of the body that has been waiting, with remarkable patience, for exactly this kind of deliberate and compassionate attention. Because the value of understanding the science behind a movement practice is only fully realized when that science is translated into something the body can actually feel and respond to, and these three seated exercises, simple enough to be performed in any chair, in any room, at any point in the day, carry within their apparent simplicity a depth of physiological impact that continues to reveal itself more fully the longer and more consistently they are practiced. The first movement, the seated glute press, begins with something so fundamental that it is easy to underestimate. Simply sitting at the forward edge of a sturdy chair with the feet placed flat on the floor, the spine lifted with quiet dignity rather than rigid military straightness, and then pressing both feet downward into the ground while simultaneously drawing the gluteal muscles together in a firm, sustained contraction that you hold for 5 to 8 seconds before releasing completely, and allowing the muscles to rest in full relaxation before the next repetition begins. And what makes this isometric training approach so particularly well suited to adults over 50 is the accumulating body of evidence showing that isometric contractions, muscular efforts that generate significant force without producing visible joint movement, build meaningful strength while placing dramatically lower shear and compressive forces on the hip, knee, and lumbar joints than dynamic resistance exercises do. meaning that the body receives a powerful neuromuscular training stimulus through a movement pattern that simultaneously protects the very joint structures that years of living have made more vulnerable to the kinds of mechanical stress that discourage older adults from engaging with strength training in the first place. The second movement, the seated lateral hip lift, introduces a resistance band looped just above the knees and asks something slightly more sophisticated of the neuromuscular system. It asks the gluteus medius to engage against external resistance in a controlled, deliberate arc of outward movement, pressing one knee slowly away from the midline of the body against the band's elastic resistance, pausing at the point of full comfortable range, and then returning with a slowness and intentionality that is itself a form of training, because the eccentric phase of a muscular contraction, the controlled lengthening of a muscle under load, has been shown in exercise science research to produce some of the most significant adaptations in muscle fiber recruitment and connective tissue resilience. And for a muscle like the gluteus medius that has spent years being largely bypassed by the nervous system's habitual movement patterns, this slow and resisted lateral press followed by a slow and controlled return begins rebuilding the neuromuscular pathway with a clarity and specificity that general lower body exercises simply cannot replicate, because the gluteus medius requires direct, targeted, and lateral plane loading to be meaningfully reawakened rather than merely peripherally stimulated. The third movement, the posterior pelvic tilt, is perhaps the most quietly revolutionary of the three, precisely because it looks the least like exercise in any conventional sense. Seated in the chair with hands resting gently on the thighs, you simply rock the pelvis backward so that the lower spine softens and flattens, then rock it forward into a gentle anterior tilt that creates a small, natural arch in the lumbar region. And you move between these two positions slowly and rhythmically, with the kind of unhurried attentiveness that allows you to actually feel what is happening in the deep stabilizing musculature of the posterior pelvis. Because what this movement is doing beneath its surface simplicity is simultaneously lubricating the sacroiliac joint through gentle, cyclic loading and unloading, reactivating the deep stabilizing fibers of the gluteus maximus that attach directly into the thoracolumbar fascia and play a critical role in spinal stability, and most importantly, it is beginning to restore the body's proprioceptive map of its own pelvic position, that intuitive, moment-to-moment sense of where the center of gravity lives and how the pelvis needs to organize itself to support balanced, confident movement, which is a capacity that quietly erodes with age and sedentary living but responds with remarkable fidelity to exactly this kind of gentle, consistent, and body-aware practice that asks nothing dramatic of the body and yet gives back something genuinely profound in return. There is a story that the science of the brain has been telling us for several decades now, assembling itself piece by piece through the work of neurologists and cognitive scientists and exercise physiologists whose research, taken together, amounts to one of the most quietly radical reframings of what human aging actually means and what it is actually capable of. And that story begins with a principle that was once considered scientifically controversial but is now so thoroughly established by empirical evidence that it has reshaped entire fields of medicine and rehabilitation, the principle that the adult brain, regardless of age, retains a fundamental and extraordinary capacity to reorganize itself, to form new synaptic connections, to strengthen existing neural pathways through repeated use, and to adapt its functional architecture in response to the demands and experiences it encounters. A capacity that neuroscientists have named neuroplasticity and that represents, for every person over 50 who has ever been told that their body's best days are irreversibly behind them, something closer to a biological promise than a mere scientific observation. What this means in the specific and practical context of seated glute training is something worth sitting with slowly, because the implications extend far beyond the muscles themselves and into the very nature of how learning and adaptation work inside an aging nervous system. Because when you perform the seated glute press, the lateral hip lift, and the posterior pelvic tilt with consistency and genuine attentiveness, you are not merely contracting and releasing muscle fibers in a mechanical sequence. You are sending a repeated, specific, and increasingly familiar electrical signal through a neural pathway that begins in the motor cortex of the brain, travels down through the corticospinal tract, crosses the neuromuscular junction where nerve meets muscle, and arrives finally at the muscle fibers of the gluteal complex, and with each repetition, with each session, with each week of consistent practice, that pathway becomes slightly more efficient, slightly more myelinated, slightly more readily accessible to the nervous system when it needs to recruit the glutes during the unpredictable and varied demands of everyday movement. Myelin, that fatty insulating sheath that wraps around nerve fibers and dramatically accelerates the speed and reliability of neural signal transmission, continues to be produced and deposited around frequently used neural pathways well into advanced age, which means that the motor learning occurring during your seated glute practice is literally changing the physical structure of your nervous system in ways that are measurable, cumulative, and durable, and the research in motor learning and neuromuscular adaptation consistently shows that meaningful improvements in muscle recruitment patterns, movement coordination, and postural stability can begin to emerge in adults over 50 within as little as 4 to 6 weeks of regular, intentional practice, not because the muscles have necessarily grown dramatically larger in that time frame, but because the nervous system has begun prioritizing the neural pathways associated with gluteal engagement, lowering the recruitment threshold so that the glutes fire earlier, more fully, and more automatically during functional movements like rising from a chair, navigating a curb, or recovering from an unexpected shift in balance. There is something philosophically significant embedded in this neuroscience that deserves to be named directly, because the conventional narrative surrounding aging and physical capacity is so thoroughly saturated with the language of inevitability and irreversibility. We speak of things being lost, of abilities fading, of the body declining, and while some of these changes are real and deserve honest acknowledgement, the story that neuroplasticity tells is fundamentally a story about retained possibility, about the nervous system's enduring responsiveness to stimulus and experience regardless of the chronological age of the person within whom it resides, and this reframing matters not only intellectually but practically, because the beliefs a person carries about their own capacity to change and improve have been shown in psychological and physiological research alike to directly influence the quality and consistency of their engagement with any health practice, meaning that understanding, truly understanding, at a level deeper than intellectual agreement, that your brain and body are capable of genuine adaptation right now, at whatever age you are reading or hearing these words, is itself a form of preparation for the training that makes that adaptation possible. There is a dimension of this conversation that the language of sets and repetitions and muscle fiber recruitment cannot fully hold, and yet it may ultimately be the most determinative factor in whether any movement practice takes root and bears fruit in a person's life over the long term, because the relationship a human being carries toward their own body, the quality of attention, the emotional temperature, the underlying narrative about what the body is and what it deserves, shapes the physiological environment within which all training occurs in ways that are not merely motivational or psychological in the soft and dismissive sense those words are sometimes used, but are deeply biological, measurable at the level of hormonal chemistry and cellular metabolism and autonomic nervous system function, and understanding this connection between inner relationship and outer physical adaptation is, in many ways, the final and most important piece of the science of rebuilding strength and balance after 50. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, produced by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threat and chronic psychological tension, exerts a direct and well-documented catabolic effect on skeletal muscle tissue, meaning that it actively promotes the breakdown of the very muscle protein that strength training is attempting to build, and while acute, short-duration cortisol release serves important adaptive functions in the body, the chronic low-grade cortisol elevation that accompanies sustained states of anxiety, self-criticism, frustration, and negative self-perception creates a biochemical environment that works in direct opposition to the goals of any muscle-building or balance rebuilding practice, suppressing the anabolic signaling pathways that govern muscle protein synthesis, blunting the sensitivity of muscle cells to insulin-like growth factor, and gradually shifting the body's metabolic priorities away from tissue repair and toward the conservational threat response physiology of an organism that believes, at a deep and largely unconscious biological level, that it is not safe enough to invest in growth. This is why the emotional and relational quality of your movement practice is not a soft addendum to the real science but is itself part of the real science, because a body approached with impatience, with harsh internal commentary about its limitations and failures, with the grinding frustration of comparing its current capacity to some remembered or imagined version of itself, is a body swimming against its own biochemistry every time it attempts to train, while a body approached with the Quality of attention that combines honest acknowledgement of present reality with genuine curiosity about what is possible and genuine compassion for the difficulty of the process is a body whose autonomic nervous system shifts measurably toward the parasympathetic state, the rest, digest, and repair state, within which muscle protein synthesis proceeds most efficiently, within which neuromuscular learning is most receptive, and within which the quiet, cumulative adaptations that transform balance and strength over weeks and months are most readily able to take hold and consolidate themselves into lasting change. The autonomic nervous system mediates this distinction in ways that extend into every corner of the body's physiology. Heart rate variability increases in parasympathetic dominance, indicating a nervous system that is flexible, responsive, and resilient rather than locked in the rigid vigilance of chronic stress activation. Muscle resting tension decreases, allowing the gluteal muscles and their surrounding fascia to move through their full range of motion without the resistance of protective guarding. Breathing deepens and slows, improving oxygen delivery to working tissues and carbon dioxide clearance from them. And the brain's prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with conscious motor learning and the formation of new movement habits, becomes more functionally active and more capable of the kind of focused, body-aware attention that transforms a simple seated exercise from a mechanical repetition into a genuine act of neuromuscular communication, which means that every moment you spend cultivating a kinder, more curious, more patient relationship with your body is a moment that is directly improving the conditions within which your glutes can be retrained, your balance can be rebuilt, and your confidence in your own physical capacity can be genuinely and sustainably restored, not as a motivational sentiment but as a measurable biological outcome of treating the human body, your body, at whatever age and in whatever condition it currently finds itself, with the same thoughtful, unhurried compassion that you would instinctively offer to anyone you loved who was doing something difficult and important and worthy of your very best attention.